8-year-old Emma's hands trembled as she stood before the imposing mahogany doors of the courthouse. The October morning was crisp and cold, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the air. She wore the pink dress her mother had carefully selected just 3 days ago, a dress that cost more than usual because her mother wanted her to look presentable before the judge. But beneath the pink fabric, Emma's heart raced with a terror that no child should ever have to experience. Inside those doors waited her destiny. Today, she would be forced to choose between the two people she loved most in the world. The realization hit her in waves throughout the week leading up to today, each wave more suffocating than the last. Her mother had cried the night before their court date, pulling Emma close in the darkness of her bedroom. "Sweetheart, I need you to be honest with the judge," her mother had whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your father isn't. He isn't safe. He says things that hurt, and sometimes he gets so angry I'm afraid. I love you so much, and I just want to keep you safe. The judge needs to know the truth." Emma had felt her mother's tears soak into her top, and she'd wanted to comfort her, to promise her that everything would be okay. But how could she make such a promise when she didn't understand what was happening? She was just 8 years old. The weight of her mother's fear had settled onto her small shoulders like a heavy blanket she couldn't shake off. But then came her father's visits, which had taken on a different character since the divorce proceedings began. He would arrive in his new car, a sleek black sedan that seemed to embody his new bachelor lifestyle, and sweep Emma up in his arms, spinning her around until she giggled despite her anxiety. He would take her to expensive restaurants where she could order anything she wanted, or to the toy store where he'd tell her to pick out whatever caught her eye. Emma loved these moments with her father. She cherished the attention and the feeling of being special. But lately, these visits had become something more complicated. During their last outing, her father had sat her down in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, his expression serious in a way that made Emma's stomach clench. "Emma, I need you to understand something," he had said, his voice low and intense. "Your mother doesn't take care of you the way I do. You know that, right? Remember when you fell at school? Your mother wasn't even paying attention. She was probably on her phone thinking about something else. That's the kind of mother she is, careless, irresponsible." He had taken her small hand in his grip firm and purposeful. "When you talk to the judge, I need you to tell him exactly what happened that day. Tell him that your mother wasn't watching you. Tell him that she doesn't care about your safety the way I do. Can you do that for me, Emma? Can you tell the judge the truth?" The problem was that Emma knew this wasn't the truth. She remembered that day at school perfectly. She had been running toward her mother in the pickup line, excited to show her the drawing she'd made in art class. Her mother had been watching her intently, her eyes focused entirely on Emma's face. When Emma's foot caught on the uneven pavement, her mother had immediately reached out to catch her, her arms ready to cushion Emma's fall. Yes, Emma had stumbled, and yes, she'd scraped her knee, but her mother had been right there, had been completely attentive and protective. It wasn't negligence, it was an accident. Just a simple, ordinary accident that could have happened to anyone. Yet her father's version of events had begun to feel real to Emma through repetition. He had brought it up again during their next visit and the next. Each time, he'd asked her to rehearse what she would say to the judge, and each time, Emma had felt something inside her twist and contort. She was beginning to doubt her own memory. Was she misremembering? Had her mother actually been distracted? The uncertainty was maddening, and it fed into the anxiety that had begun to consume her days and nights. The pressure had manifested in physical ways. Emma's appetite had diminished. She picked at her meals while her mother watched with concern. She developed a nervous habit of biting her nails until they bled. She had trouble sleeping, lying awake at night, her mind cycling through conversations with both parents, trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't. She'd started having stomachaches before visits with her father and headaches before meetings with her mother. Her teacher, Mrs., had pulled her aside at school and asked if everything was okay at home. Emma hadn't known what to say. How could she explain that her home itself had become a war zone, that she was the battlefield? Now, standing before the courthouse doors, Emma felt the full weight of that internal conflict pressing down on her. She clutched the gold locket her father had given her, a locket containing a photo of him on one side and her on the other. At the same time, she wore the pink dress her mother had chosen, a silent declaration of her mother's influence. Emma felt like she was being torn in two, her loyalty to each parent creating an impossible tension within her small frame. She was wearing contradictions, living contradictions. The courthouse itself was intimidating in ways Emma hadn't anticipated. She had imagined something she'd seen in movies or television shows, but the reality was far more austere and serious. The marble floors gleamed with a cold, institutional shine. High ceilings stretched above her head, making her feel impossibly small. The hallways echoed with the sound of adult footsteps and hushed conversations. Everything about this place seemed designed to emphasize power and authority, to make people feel insignificant and vulnerable. Her mother had taken time off work to be there, and Emma could see the stress etched into every line of her face. There were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal, and she kept wringing her hands together as they walked through the courthouse hallway. Her mother's lawyer, a sharp woman named Ms., walked beside them, speaking in low tones about strategy and testimony. Emma's mother placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but Emma could feel the tremor in her touch. Her mother was frightened too. Then came the moment when the bailiff led her toward the courtroom itself, and Emma's heart began to pound so violently she thought it might break through her ribs. The large wooden doors loomed before her like the entrance to some terrible underworld. This was it, the moment when her testimony would either protect her mother or condemn her. This was the moment when she would have to choose in front of a judge between the truth and her father's version of events. The guilt of even considering betraying her father's wishes washed over her in waves, even though she knew his version was false. And then, as she stepped into the courtroom, her anxious eyes swept across the room, taking in the judge sitting elevated on his bench like some powerful deity, the lawyers at their tables with their neat folders and serious expressions, the court stenographer poised to record every word she spoke. And there, in the corner near the bailiff's station, she saw him, Max. The golden retriever sat in perfect, patient stillness, his warm brown eyes observing the proceedings with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Max was the only living thing in this nightmare that didn't want anything from her, that didn't have an agenda. Max simply existed, present and calm, in the midst of this chaos and pain. Emma took a shaky breath as she was sworn in, placing her small hand on the Bible the bailiff held out to her. The weight of impossible choices pressed down on her shoulders, and she wondered how she would ever find the strength to navigate this day. As she sat down in the witness chair, her eyes drifted back to Max one more time, drawing comfort from his steady, unwavering presence in the cold courtroom. The courtroom fell silent as Emma was positioned in the witness chair, elevated slightly so that she could be seen by everyone in the room. The chair itself was uncomfortable, a wooden seat with a back that didn't quite fit her small frame. She had to sit forward slightly just to rest her feet on the footrest provided for children. The microphone in front of her amplified her breathing, making it sound loud and tremulous in the quiet room. Judge Harrison, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, looked down at her with an expression that was meant to be reassuring but felt merely official. Emma understood, on some level, that this man held her entire future in his hands. Whatever she said in the next moments would shape the trajectory of her life. Emma's mother's lawyer, Ms., stood up first. "Emma, I'm going to ask you some questions about what happened at your school a few weeks ago. You don't need to be nervous. Just tell us what you remember, okay?" Miz's voice was soft and gentle, and Emma felt a small measure of relief. This woman had visited their home twice before the hearing, preparing Emma for her testimony. She'd been kind, and she'd never asked Emma to lie or to say anything that wasn't true. "Can you tell us about the day you fell at school?" Emma opened her mouth to speak, and the words began to form on her lips. She wanted to tell the truth, she truly did. She wanted to say that her mother had been right there, that she had been watching Emma carefully, that the accident was simply an unfortunate moment that had nothing to do with her mother's attentiveness or care. She wanted to explain that she had been the one who was distracted, rushing with excitement to show her mother her artwork. The truth felt clear and pure in her mind, waiting to be spoken aloud. But then, almost like a physical force, the memory of her father's words crashed through her consciousness. She could hear his voice in her head, calm but firm. "Tell the judge that your mother wasn't watching you. Tell him she was on her phone. Tell him she doesn't care about your safety." She could see his face, the stern expression he got when he was disappointed, the way his jaw clenched when things didn't go according to his plan. Emma's mouth went dry. Her hands, which rested on the armrests of the witness chair, began to perspire. "Emma," Ms. prompted gently, "can you tell us what happened?" Emma's voice, when it came out, was barely above a whisper. I fell," she started hesitantly. The words felt like they were coming from someone else, like she was watching herself speak from outside her body. "I was running and I tripped." "And where was your mother when this happened?" Ms. asked. This was the moment. This was the point of no return. Emma felt her heart rate increase to a frantic pace. She thought about her father's disappointed expression, about the way he'd withdrawn his affection during their last visit when she'd accidentally mentioned something her mother had said. She thought about his new girlfriend, who was always there during their visits now, making Emma feel like an outsider in her father's new life. What if, by telling the truth, she lost him entirely? What if he decided that shared custody wasn't worth the effort, and he simply stopped calling, stopped visiting altogether? She wasn't really paying attention, Emma heard herself say, and the lie felt like poison on her tongue. The words tasted wrong, felt wrong, but they were out there now, floating in the air of the courtroom, being recorded by the stenographer's fingers flying across her machine. Emma could feel her mother's sharp intake of breath from the gallery behind her. She didn't dare look back. Then came the moment when Emma's father's lawyer stood up. His name was Mr., and he was a tall man with sharp features and cold blue eyes. He had visited their father's home once to prepare him for the hearing, and Emma had overheard parts of their conversation through the closed study door. Mr. circled the witness stand like a predator, and Emma suddenly understood what it meant to feel like prey. He was hunting for something, for weakness, for inconsistencies, for the kind of contradictions that could be exploited. "Emma, when you fell at school, did your mother catch you?" Mr. asked, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a knife. Emma's mind raced. She remembered her mother's arms, strong and steady, reaching out toward her. She remembered the feeling of being caught, of being safe. But she also remembered her father's coaching, his insistent voice drilling the false narrative into her consciousness. "No," Emma said quietly, "she didn't catch me. In fact, your mother wasn't even looking in your direction, was she?" Mr. continued, his tone suggesting that he already knew the answer, that he was simply waiting for her confirmation. I'm not sure," Emma stammered, and this was partially true. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. Her own memories felt unreliable, contaminated by her father's repeated insistence that she must have misremembered. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe her mother really had been distracted. The doubt, once planted, had grown like a poison weed, spreading through her certainty until everything felt uncertain. Mr. continued his assault, each question designed to chip away at her composure. "Has your mother ever been late picking you up from school?" "Yes, occasionally." "Has your mother ever been on her phone while driving?" Emma supposed so, like most adults. "Would you say your mother is sometimes forgetful?" Emma found herself nodding, even though her mother was usually extremely organized and careful. Each affirmative answer seemed to build toward a larger narrative, that Emma's mother was negligent, irresponsible, and unsafe. Emma felt tears beginning to well up in her eyes. Her hands shook against the armrests of the witness chair. She knew what was happening on some level. She was being manipulated, her words being used to construct a false image of her mother. But she felt powerless to stop it. The courtroom seemed to be tilting around her, and she gripped the chair more tightly, afraid that she might actually fall if she didn't hold on. The judge intervened at one point, asking if she needed a break, if she wanted some water. Emma shook her head mutely. She just wanted this to be over. She wanted to go home, wherever home was supposed to be. She wanted her parents to stop fighting, wanted to go back to a time when her biggest concern was what to wear to school or whether she'd get picked for the soccer team. As the questioning continued, Emma found herself in a strange psychological state. Part of her was retreating, becoming smaller and smaller, trying to disappear into herself entirely. Another part of her was watching the proceedings from a distance, observing with a kind of detached horror as she participated in her own mother's character assassination. She was saying things that she didn't believe, agreeing with implications that she knew were false, painting a portrait of her mother that bore little resemblance to the woman who had held her after nightmares, who had worked 2 jobs to provide for her, who had loved her unconditionally even when that love was being weaponized against her. Emma's voice grew quieter as the questioning went on, until she was barely audible even with the microphone amplifying her words. She kept her eyes downcast, unable to meet anyone's gaze, unable to look at her mother's face, which she knew must be reflecting devastation. She felt the weight of her own betrayal settling onto her chest like a physical object, making it difficult to breathe. When Mr. finally concluded his questioning with a satisfied expression, Emma sat in the witness chair, her small body seeming to deflate with exhaustion. She had done what her father had asked her to do. She had told his version of the truth, had made her mother look bad, had contributed to the narrative that was being constructed to take her away from the one parent who had never asked her to lie, who had never manipulated her, who had only ever tried to protect her. But as she looked up, still unable to meet anyone's eyes directly, she caught sight of Max in his corner. The golden retriever was watching her with those intelligent brown eyes, and Emma could have sworn she saw something like concern reflected in his gaze. She wondered if the dog somehow understood what she had just done, if he could sense the wrongness of her words hanging in the courtroom air like a tangible thing. Emma felt something crack inside her chest, a fracture forming in the carefully constructed facade she had been maintaining. She didn't know it yet, but this crack would widen, and eventually, when it became a chasm, everything would change. The courtroom seemed to spin around Emma as she sat rigidly in the witness chair, her small body trembling with the effort of holding herself together. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with an incessant hum that seemed to grow louder and louder, until it felt like the sound was happening inside her head rather than in the physical space around her. She could taste copper in her mouth. She had been biting the inside of her cheek so hard that she'd drawn blood. Her fingernails were now bitten down to the quick, raw and painful, small crescents of skin torn away where she'd been nervously picking at them throughout the questioning. The cross-examination had concluded, but the damage was done. The narrative had been established. In the eyes of everyone in the courtroom, Emma had that her mother was negligent, inattentive, and unfit to be the primary caregiver. The lies she had spoken hung in the air like a toxic fog, and she had to breathe them in with every breath. Emma felt utterly alone, despite being surrounded by people. Her mother sat in the gallery, but Emma couldn't bring herself to look back at her. The shame was too overwhelming, the guilt too suffocating. Ms. her mother's lawyer had requested a few moments to ask some follow-up questions, redirect examination she'd called it. She stood up now, her expression one of concern mixed with determination. "Emma, I want to ask you something," she said gently. "On the day you fell at school, can you describe to me exactly what you were doing right before the fall happened? What were you thinking about?" Emma's heart rate, which had been elevated throughout the questioning, now spiked even higher. This was it. This was her opportunity to tell the truth. Ms. was asking her an open-ended question, giving her space to provide context and detail. If Emma wanted to walk back her earlier testimony, to explain that she had been rushing to show her mother her artwork, this was her moment. This was when she could undo some of the damage, could begin to restore the truth. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she felt a sudden wave of panic crash over her. She thought about her father sitting in the courtroom, about the way his expression would change if she contradicted what she'd already said. She imagined his face hardening with disappointment, imagined him standing up and walking out of the courtroom, never looking back. She thought about his new apartment, decorated with furniture she'd never seen before, with pictures of his new girlfriend on the walls but only one picture of Emma, relegated to a shelf in his bedroom. She thought about losing him entirely, about becoming just another failed relationship in his life, something to be discarded and forgotten. I was just running, Emma heard herself say, her voice barely recognizable as her own. It sounded small and frightened and defeated. I wasn't really paying attention to where I was going. It was a non-answer, a dodge. Miz's expression flickered with disappointment and something that might have been pity. She asked another question, trying a different approach. Emma, did your mother reach out toward you when you started to fall? For a moment, just a fraction of a second, Emma's memory flickered with the truth. She could see her mother's hands moving with swift determination, the concerned expression on her face, the way her mother's body had tensed as she tried to break Emma's fall. But then Emma's father's coaching kicked in, the repeated narrative that had been drilled into her consciousness. Your mother wasn't paying attention. She was too slow. She didn't care enough to watch you properly. I don't remember, Emma said. And this lie felt even worse than the previous ones because it was a refusal to engage with the truth at all. It was a retreat into ambiguity, a way of pretending that she couldn't remember what she actually remembered perfectly well. The judge intervened, his expression showing signs of fatigue. Does the witness need a break? He asked, peering down at Emma over his reading glasses. She shook her head mutely, unable to speak. If she took a break, if she had even a few moments alone with Miz, she might be able to confess the truth. She might be able to explain that she'd been coached, that the story she'd been telling wasn't accurate. The fear of that possibility was almost as overwhelming as the fear of losing her father. As the hearing continued, moving on to other matters, Emma was finally released from the witness chair. She walked on shaky legs back to sit with her mother, but she couldn't meet her mother's eyes. The woman beside her, the woman who had raised her, loved her, protected her, felt like a stranger now, or perhaps worse, like someone Emma had betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. Her mother reached out and tried to take her hand, but Emma pulled away. She couldn't bear the touch, couldn't bear the forgiveness that she knew would come, because that forgiveness would only magnify her own guilt. Emma sat as far away from her mother as the bench would allow, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold together the pieces of her fractured self. The emotional toll of the morning had begun to manifest in her body in obvious ways. Emma felt hot, then cold, then hot again. Her stomach churned with nausea. She was trembling so violently that she had to press her hands between her knees to try to control the shaking. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool temperature of the courtroom. She felt like she might throw up at any moment, like her body was rejecting the lies even if her mouth had spoken them. During the recess that followed, Emma sat alone in a small waiting area adjacent to the courtroom. She was supposed to wait for her mother, but when Miz came to check on her, she found Emma curled up in the corner of a chair, her knees drawn up to her chest, rocking slightly back and forth in a self-soothing motion that was heartbreaking in its desperation. The lawyer knelt down beside her, genuine concern etched across her face. "Emma, honey, are you okay?" Miz asked. But of course she wasn't okay. Nobody was okay in this situation. Emma was a child who had been forced to choose between her parents, who had been coached and manipulated and pressured until she'd agreed to tell lies that felt like poison in her mouth. She was a child whose internal integrity had been shattered, who now had to live with the knowledge that she had betrayed the parent who loved her unconditionally. Emma didn't respond to Miz's question. She just continued rocking, her eyes staring at nothing, her mind in a state of complete overwhelm. She felt untethered from reality, as if the world around her had become dreamlike and surreal. Was any of this actually happening, or had she somehow slipped into a nightmare from which she would eventually wake? Back in the gallery, Emma's father sat with a satisfied expression on his face. The testimony had gone better than he'd hoped. His lawyer had suggested that they might need additional witnesses or more evidence, but this testimony from Emma herself was gold. Children didn't usually lie on the witness stand. Judges knew that. So Emma's words would carry significant weight. He allowed himself a small smile of victory. But Emma, crumpled in that chair in the waiting area, felt like everything inside her was dying. She had done what she was supposed to do, had pleased her father by saying what he'd coached her to say. But in the process, she had lost something essential: her sense of herself as an honest person, her integrity, her ability to trust her own perceptions and memories. She had become complicit in a lie so large that it threatened to consume her entirely. The conflict between her need to maintain her father's love and her need to speak the truth had created a psychological pressure cooker inside her small body. Something had to give. Something had to break. And as the recess ended and she was called back into the courtroom for the afternoon session, Emma didn't know if she could survive another moment of this internal torture. She walked back into the courtroom on unsteady legs, her eyes searching desperately for something, anything that could offer her a moment of respite or comfort. And that's when she saw him again. Max, the golden retriever, sitting calmly in his corner, his intelligent eyes following her movement across the courtroom. For the first time that day, Emma felt something other than despair. She felt a spark of recognition, of connection, of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was another way forward. Maybe there was someone, or something, that could help her find the courage to tell the truth. The afternoon session of the custody hearing began with an almost unbearable heaviness hanging in the courtroom air. Emma was called back to the stand for additional questioning from both attorneys, and she shuffled forward in a daze, her body moving almost mechanically. She felt hollowed out, as if the emotional turmoil of the morning had sucked away all her reserves of energy and resilience. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying during the recess, though she'd done her best to wipe away the tears before returning. The pink dress her mother had chosen now felt like a costume, something alien draped across her skin that didn't represent who she really was. As Emma settled into the witness chair once more, her hands gripped the armrests so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, her father's eyes filled with anticipation, her mother's eyes filled with sorrow, the judge's eyes filled with the detached observation of someone accustomed to family tragedy. The weight of all those gazes pressed down on her like a physical force. She wanted to disappear, to fold herself into nothingness, to become so small that nobody could see her or ask her questions or force her to choose between the people she loved. Mr. stood up again, and Emma felt her stomach clench. He had a particular line of questioning he wanted to pursue, and she could sense that he was going for the kill, the final, devastating questions that would cement his narrative and destroy any remaining credibility her mother might have in the judge's eyes. He began with seemingly innocent questions, building a foundation for something larger. "Emma, has your mother ever been too busy to help you with your homework?" he asked. Emma thought about this. Her mother worked long hours, and sometimes when she was tired, they would schedule homework time for the next day. But her mother had never refused to help her, never prioritized anything over Emma's education. Still, technically, yes. There had been moments when her mother had been too busy immediately, though not too busy eventually. Sometimes, Emma heard herself say, her voice becoming quieter. "Has your mother ever raised her voice at you or shown anger?" Mr. continued, and now Emma recognized what he was doing. He was casting about for anything negative, any small imperfection in her mother's parenting that could be and distorted into evidence of unfitness. Emma thought about the times her mother had lost patience, the occasions when she'd spoken sharply because she was frustrated or overwhelmed. She thought about the time her mother had raised her voice, when Emma had run into the street without looking, the sheer terror and fury that had driven that moment of anger born entirely from fear for Emma's safety. "Yes," Emma answered, and she could see Mr. Satisfaction growing. He was building a portrait of her mother as an angry, impatient, negligent woman, cobbling together half-truths and isolated incidents into a distorted whole. As the questioning continued, Emma felt something shifting inside her. It wasn't just sadness or anxiety anymore. It was a deeper, more fundamental sense of wrongness. She was participating in something profoundly unjust. She was helping to destroy her mother's relationship with her, helping to paint a false picture of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her well-being. The cognitive dissonance between what she knew to be true and what she was saying had grown to unbearable proportions. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Her vision started to blur slightly at the edges. She felt as if she were drowning, even though she was sitting safely in a dry courtroom surrounded by people. Her small chest felt tight, her heart racing so fast that she could barely hear anything over the pounding in her ears. This was it. She was having a panic attack, something she'd never experienced before, but which her body seemed to recognize instinctively as appropriate to the magnitude of her psychological distress. Emma's hands began to shake violently. She tried to grip the armrests more tightly, but the shaking continued, uncontrollable and obvious to everyone in the courtroom. She could feel her mother's distress intensifying, could sense the judge leaning forward with concern, could perceive a subtle shift in the room's energy as people began to notice that something was fundamentally wrong with this child. Mr. Sensing that Emma was reaching a breaking point, decided to go in for the final blow. Emma, if given the choice, wouldn't you prefer to live with your father, who clearly cares so much more about your safety and than your mother does? The question hung in the air like a sword. This was the question that would cement everything, that would provide the legal justification for tearing Emma away from her mother. All Emma had to do was answer yes, and it would be over. Her father would win. She would lose her mother as her primary caregiver. And in that moment, as Emma opened her mouth to give the answer she'd been coached to give, something inside her shattered completely. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. The panic that had been building throughout the morning suddenly erupted into a full-blown crisis. Emma's small frame convulsed with silent sobs, her shoulders heaving, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as she tried desperately to find air. She was hyperventilating, her body responding to the unbearable psychological pressure with a physical emergency. It was in this moment of absolute desperation and complete emotional breakdown, that Emma made a decision that she herself didn't fully understand. Her therapeutic sessions with Max had taught her grounding techniques, ways to manage anxiety and overwhelming emotion. One of those techniques involved a physical signal, a specific gesture that her therapist had taught her to use when she was overwhelmed and needed help. It was 3 quick taps on her own chest, a signal that meant, "I need help, I'm in crisis, I can't manage this alone." Emma's trembling hand rose to her chest, and without conscious thought, driven entirely by instinct and desperation, she made the signal. 3 quick taps, sharp and deliberate despite her panic. It was a gesture so small that most people in the courtroom barely noticed it. The judge started to call for a recess, recognizing that the child was in medical or psychological distress. The bailiff moved forward, uncertain what to do. But Max noticed. Max, the golden retriever sitting patiently in the corner of the courtroom, saw that signal with absolute clarity. His entire body tensed, his ears perked forward, his intelligent brown eyes locked onto Emma with fierce intensity. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. The dog's years of training, his innate emotional intelligence, and his therapeutic bonding with Emma converged into a single, decisive response. Max stood up, his movement sudden and purposeful. The bailiff moved toward him uncertain, but there was no aggression in the dog's posture. Instead, there was something almost sacred about his movement, something that radiated intention and compassion. Max walked directly across the courtroom floor, his nails clicking against the marble with each deliberate step. Everyone watched in stunned silence, uncertain what was happening. The dog approached Emma's chair and with perfect gentleness placed his head directly on her lap. His warm, solid presence was like an anchor, grounding her in reality, pulling her back from the brink of complete psychological dissolution. Max's brown eyes gazed into hers with such profound understanding, such absolute acceptance of her pain, that Emma felt something fundamentally shift within her. Judge Harrison's gavel froze in midair. The court stenographer's fingers stopped moving across her machine. Even Mr. mid-sentence fell silent. The entire courtroom held its collective breath as this extraordinary moment unfolded before their eyes. This wasn't a trained performance or a dramatic gesture designed for effect. This was authentic, genuine, and profoundly moving, a living creature responding to genuine distress with pure compassion. Emma's panic began to subside, replaced by something else, a sense of being truly seen, truly understood, truly supported. Max remained pressed against her, his solid warmth a physical manifestation of unconditional acceptance. In that moment, Emma understood something fundamental. There was another way forward. She didn't have to keep lying. She didn't have to keep betraying her mother. There was someone, something, that believed in her, that accepted her, that offered her a path toward authenticity and truth. The courtroom, which had been a place of fear and pressure and impossible choices, suddenly transformed into a space where healing could begin. And it was Max, with his simple, profound gesture of compassionate presence, who had made that transformation possible. The courtroom remained frozen in that moment of profound silence that follows genuine emotional truth. Judge Harrison sat motionless on his elevated bench, his stern judicial expression cracking like ice in spring thaw. The court stenographer's hands, which had been poised over her machine, slowly lowered to rest. Even the ambient sounds of the courtroom, the subtle hum of air conditioning, the creaking of the building's wooden infrastructure, seemed to fade into insignificance. All that existed in this moment was Emma, Max, and the undeniable reality of authentic compassion unfolding before everyone's eyes. Emma's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow during her panic attack, began to slow and deepen. Max's head remained on her lap, a solid, warm, unchanging presence. The dog's coat was soft beneath her trembling fingers, and she found herself stroking his fur almost instinctively, drawing comfort from the simple, grounding physicality of the contact. With each breath, with each gentle stroke across Max's golden fur, Emma felt something fundamental shifting within her psychological landscape. The pressure that had been crushing her chest began to ease, not disappearing entirely, but becoming bearable, manageable. Judge Harrison slowly lowered his gavel to the bench. He removed his reading glasses with deliberate care, as if the world had suddenly changed, and the instruments of his profession no longer served their intended purpose. He leaned back in his chair, studying Emma with an expression that had completely transformed from judicial impatience to something far more human, profound concern mixed with a kind of recognition. He had spent 23 years sitting on that bench, listening to testimony, making decisions that shaped people's lives. In all that time, he had developed a finely tuned ability to discern truth from fabrication, authenticity from performance. And what he was witnessing now transcended all the courtroom machinations and legal arguments. This was genuine human suffering. This was a child in crisis. This was something that demanded to be recognized and addressed on a fundamental level. "I think we need to take a recess," the judge announced, his voice carrying a different tone than before. Not the authoritative, commanding voice of judicial power, but something gentler, more cognizant of the humanity involved in these proceedings. "Court will recess for 30 minutes. Everyone will remain in the courtroom or nearby. We are not finished here." The bailiff seemed uncertain about what to do regarding Max. The dog had technically violated courtroom protocol by moving without permission, but Judge Harrison raised a hand, silencing the bailiff before he could speak. "Leave the dog where he is," the judge said simply. "The dog is providing therapeutic support to the witness. This is acceptable." As the formality of the courtroom temporarily relaxed, Emma remained in the witness chair with Max beside her. Ms., her mother's lawyer, approached slowly and carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal that might startle. "Emma, sweetheart, you don't have to say anything right now," she said gently. "But I want you to know that if you need to tell the truth about what happened, this is a safe place to do that. I'm here to protect you and to advocate for you. Whatever you need to say, I will support you." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but these were different from the panic-stricken tears of before. These were tears of release, of relief, of the beginning of emotional unburdening. She wanted to speak. She desperately wanted to unburden herself of the weight of the lies, to finally tell the truth that had been burning inside her like a fire she could no longer contain. But she didn't know how to start. She didn't know how to explain the coaching without seeming disloyal to her father. She didn't know how to articulate the impossible position she'd been placed in without sounding like she was making excuses. "I want to tell the truth," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible even in the relative quiet of the recessed courtroom. "But I'm scared." "I know you are," Miss said, and her voice carried such genuine compassion that Emma felt another wave of tears begin to flow. "But I want you to know that telling the truth is the bravest thing you can do right now. And you're not alone. You have people who care about you and who will protect you." Emma looked down at Max, whose dark eyes gazed back at her with perfect understanding. The dog hadn't asked her to lie. Max had never pushed her toward deception or manipulation. Max simply existed in his authenticity, responding to genuine emotion with genuine compassion. In that moment, Emma understood something profound. The only way forward was through truth. The only path to healing was through honesty. And she couldn't do it alone, but she didn't have to. She had her therapist, she had her mother's lawyer, she had Max, and somewhere deep inside herself, she had her own internal compass pointing toward integrity. As the 30-minute recess drew to a close, Emma made a decision. When the judge called the court back into session, she would tell the truth, all of it. She would explain how her father had coached her, would detail the exact words he'd used, would confess that her testimony that morning had been fundamentally dishonest. She knew that doing so might jeopardize her relationship with her father. She knew that he might be angry, might withdraw his affection, might decide that the custody battle wasn't worth pursuing anymore. But she also knew, with a clarity that cut through all her fear, that she couldn't continue living in this state of psychological fracture. She couldn't be a person who had lied in court, who had betrayed her mother, who had compromised her own integrity for the sake of maintaining an unhealthy relationship. The bailiff announced that court was back in session. Judge Harrison returned to his elevated bench, and Emma was reminded once again to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She looked at her father, who was watching her with an expression of confusion. He seemed to sense that something had shifted, that his plan was somehow unraveling. Emma saw his jaw tighten, saw his hand clench into a fist on the table in front of him. Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Emma, before we continue with further testimony, I want to ask you directly, is there something you need to tell this court? Something that you may have left out of your earlier testimony?" Emma's heart pounded. This was the moment. This was the point of no return. She looked at Max, who remained calmly at her side, his presence a constant reassurance. She took a deep breath, drawing courage from the dog's unwavering support. "I wasn't telling the truth before," Emma said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My dad told me what to say. He said I had to tell you that my mom wasn't paying attention when I fell at school. But that's not what happened. My mom was watching me. She was right there. She tried to catch me." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Emma's father's face went white, then rapidly flushed red. His lawyer leaned over and began speaking urgently in his ear. But Emma continued, the words now pouring out like water from a broken dam, unstoppable and cleansing. "He told me to say my mom doesn't care about me and isn't safe. But that's a lie. My mom loves me more than anyone. She's always been there for me. My dad told me what to say because he wanted to win the custody thing. He said if I didn't say it, he wouldn't love me anymore. He said I had to choose him or my mom, and if I chose my mom, he would go away." Emma's voice cracked with emotion, but she continued, driven by the therapeutic presence of Max and the knowledge that truth, however painful, was the only path forward. She described the coaching in detail, recounted the specific words her father had used, explained how he'd prepared her and drilled her, and made her rehearse the false narrative again and again until it had begun to feel real. Judge Harrison's expression had transformed from surprise to something more complex, a recognition of the gravity of what he was hearing, the realization that he had nearly rendered a judgment based on a child's coerced testimony. He looked across the courtroom at Emma's mother, whose face was streaked with tears of vindication and relief. Most importantly, he looked at Emma with a new understanding. This child had found the courage to tell the truth, and in doing so, she had fundamentally altered the trajectory of this entire case. "Emma, I want you to know that you have done a very brave thing today," Judge Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have told the truth even though it was difficult and scary. That takes real courage, and this court recognizes your honesty and your integrity." Emma felt something release inside her, not the anxiety or fear which still remained, but the crushing weight of the lies, the burden of complicity and deception. She had spoken her truth. She had reclaimed her voice. And in doing so, she had taken the first step toward genuine healing, not just for herself, but for her entire family. Judge Harrison called for an immediate recess following Emma's confession, but this time it was different from the previous breaks. This recess had the weight of consequence behind it. The judge's expression had transformed into something stern and focused. The judicial mask had returned, but now it served a different purpose. He wasn't just presiding over a custody dispute anymore. He was investigating potential perjury, child abuse, and the deliberate manipulation of legal proceedings. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Harrison summoned his clerk and made several phone calls from his chambers. The first was to the court staff psychologist, a woman with 30 years of experience in evaluating family dynamics and child welfare cases. The judge arranged for an emergency consultation during the recess. He also contacted the court evaluator assigned to the case, requesting an expedited review of both parents' psychological profiles and parenting histories. While waiting for these consultations, Judge Harrison did something he rarely allowed himself to do. He reflected deeply on his own career and the cases he'd presided over. He thought about his own daughter, now in college, and wondered if she had ever felt pressured during her parents' separation when he himself was going through a divorce 20 years ago. Had she been manipulated or coached? Had she felt forced to choose? The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The systems he'd spent his life working within had potential flaws that he'd never fully grappled with. He had accepted testimony at face value, had rendered judgments based on evidence that might have been contaminated, might have been the result of parental manipulation that he'd failed to recognize. Doctor arrived within an hour, her expression serious and professional. Judge Harrison walked her through Emma's testimony, both the false testimony from the morning and her subsequent confession. He described her panic attack, her obvious distress, and the dog's intervention. He provided context about her earlier demeanor and behavioral changes throughout the hearing. "What you're describing is textbook child abuse," Doctor said without hesitation. "Coercing a child to lie in a custody proceeding, threatening to withdraw affection if she doesn't comply, forcing her to choose between her parents. These are forms of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse. The child is experiencing significant distress as a result. The panic attack you witnessed is a manifestation of the psychological pressure she's been subjected to." The psychologist leaned forward, her expression grave. "Judge, I need to be direct. This child is at risk, not necessarily of physical harm, but of significant psychological damage. The fact that she was able to break through and tell the truth is actually quite remarkable. Many children in similar situations never do. They internalize the false narrative, they blame themselves for the family conflict, they develop anxiety disorders, depression, potentially worse outcomes down the line." Judge Harrison listened intently, absorbing every word. He had presided over hundreds of custody cases, but he was beginning to understand that his understanding had been incomplete. He had treated these cases as legal matters to be resolved through the careful application of law and evidence. But what he was facing now was the human reality beneath the legal framework: a child's psychological survival, a family's fundamental ability to function in a healthy way. "What should this court do?" the judge asked. Doctor considered this carefully. First, you need to understand that shared custody in this case would be harmful to the child. When one parent has manipulated the child in this way, the child needs stability and a primary caregiver who has not engaged in such manipulation. Second, the manipulative parent needs intervention, psychological treatment, parenting counseling, evaluation of whether he poses an ongoing risk to the child's. Third, the child herself needs consistent therapeutic support to process what has happened and to rebuild her sense of trust in her own perceptions and memories. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, the pieces beginning to fall into place in his mind. He called the court evaluator and requested an emergency written assessment of both parents' psychological profiles, with particular attention to manipulative tendencies, emotional regulation, and attitudes toward the child's. He also requested recommendations regarding custody arrangements and therapeutic interventions. As these processes unfolded behind the scenes, Judge Harrison made a decision that would reshape this entire case. He would not simply render a judgment based on the evidence presented. Instead, he would use this case as an opportunity to intervene in a way that prioritized the child's psychological health above all other considerations. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison addressed the room with a gravity that silenced even the whispered conversations. "This court is taking a recess to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of this case," he announced. "During the recess, I am requesting emergency psychological evaluations of both parents to be completed within 48 hours. I am also requesting a detailed report from our court psychologist regarding the child's current psychological state and her needs moving forward." Emma's father's lawyer stood up immediately. "Your Honor, with respect, this is beyond the scope of—" Judge Harrison raised his hand, silencing the objection before it could fully form. "Counsel, what I witnessed in this courtroom today indicates that this case involves issues that extend far beyond standard custody determinations. A child's fundamental psychological integrity may be at stake. This court intends to ensure that whatever judgment is rendered prioritizes the child's, not the desires of either parent." There was a quiet power in the judge's tone that brooked no argument. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of his words settled over everyone present. During the 48-hour recess, Judge Harrison reviewed the emergency evaluations as they came in. The picture they painted was stark and troubling. Emma's father showed patterns of narcissistic traits, a tendency to prioritize his own needs over his child's, and a concerning comfort with manipulating facts to achieve his desired outcomes. The evaluator noted that while he was not a danger to the child in terms of physical abuse, he posed a significant risk to her psychological development through his pattern of emotional manipulation and coercion. Emma's mother, by contrast, showed no concerning patterns. She was dedicated to her daughters, had maintained stability even during the stressful custody proceedings, and demonstrated appropriate boundaries and emotional regulation. The evaluator noted that while she had some anxiety regarding the custody situation, this was entirely appropriate given the circumstances, and did not indicate any psychological unfitness as a parent. Doctor's report was particularly impactful. She documented Emma's anxiety disorder symptoms, the trauma she had experienced as a result of being placed in an impossible psychological position, and her need for ongoing therapeutic support. Importantly, she noted that Emma's ability to ultimately tell the truth, despite the intense pressure to maintain the false narrative, indicated a child with significant internal strength and resilience. However, she also noted that without proper therapeutic intervention, Emma was at risk of developing more severe mental health issues, including depression and complex PTSD. The most striking observation in Doctor's report was her assessment of Max's role in Emma's breakthrough. She wrote, "The therapeutic intervention provided by the dog appeared to be transformative. The dog's presence provided the child with the emotional grounding and safety she needed to access her own truth. This suggests that continued therapeutic work with the animal may be beneficial as the child processes the trauma of these proceedings." Judge Harrison sat in his chambers late into the evening, reading and rereading these reports. He thought about the countless other cases he had handled where similar dynamics might have been present but unrecognized. He thought about children who had been forced to lie in court, who had been manipulated by parents who prioritized their own needs over their children's psychological. He thought about the responsibility he carried, not just to apply the law, but to truly understand the human realities beneath the legal framework. When he looked at photographs of Emma that had been included in the court file, photos showing a smiling, bright-eyed child before the custody battle began, his resolve hardened. Whatever happened next, whatever judgment he rendered, it needed to be guided by one principle above all others: protection of the child, not victory for either parent, not the application of legal precedent at the expense of human, but genuine, authentic protection of an innocent child who had suffered enormously as a result of adult conflict. He began drafting his judgment, not with legal citations and precedent, but with a careful, detailed analysis of what had actually happened in his courtroom and what the evidence revealed about each parent's character and fitness. He documented Emma's coerced testimony and her subsequent courageous confession. He noted the psychological evaluations and their findings. And he began to formulate a decision that would be unprecedented in his courtroom, one based not on winning, but on healing, not on punishment, but on accountability and redemption, not on choosing one parent over another, but on protecting a child from further harm while offering the other parent an opportunity to change. As he worked late into the night, Judge Harrison realized that Emma's truth-telling had transformed not just her case, but his entire understanding of his role as a judge. He was no longer simply deciding who won and who lost. He was facilitating the possibility of genuine family healing. The courtroom was packed when Judge Harrison reconvened the hearing 2 days later. Word had begun to circulate about Emma's confession and the dramatic shift in the case's trajectory. Court personnel whispered in hallways. Lawyers involved in other cases speculated about what might happen, but nothing could have prepared anyone for the magnitude of what Judge Harrison was about to announce. The judge entered from his chambers with a gravity that seemed to fill the entire room with weight. He looked older somehow, as if the weight of understanding what had truly occurred in his courtroom had aged him. He settled into his elevated chair and surveyed the room, Emma's mother sitting with her lawyer, her eyes red but hopeful. Emma's father sitting rigidly beside his attorney, his face flushed with controlled anger. Emma herself, sitting between her mother and Ms., with Max resting his head on her lap beneath the table, his presence a constant source of grounding. "Before I announce this court's judgment," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the formal authority of his position but also something more, a deep moral conviction. "I want to address some matters that have come to light during these proceedings." He paused, removing his glasses and setting them carefully on the bench in front of him. The gesture was deliberate, suggesting that what was about to follow transcended the formal structures of law. "This court has been presented with evidence that indicates a child in custody dispute has been subjected to psychological manipulation, emotional coercion, and testimony coaching. This court has determined, based on expert psychological evaluation and the testimony provided in this proceeding, that one parent deliberately prepared this child to provide false testimony in a court of law, threatening withdrawal of parental affection if the child did not comply with his demands." Emma's father's attorney rose to object, but the judge's raised hand silenced him immediately. The fact that a child was able to overcome this pressure and tell the truth in this courtroom demonstrates extraordinary courage and resilience. However, it also indicates that this child has been subjected to significant psychological harm as a result of adult conflict and parental manipulation. Therefore, this court's judgment must prioritize this child's psychological safety and above all other considerations. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his expression stern but not unkind. I am now prepared to announce this court's custody determination. The room fell silent, everyone leaning forward slightly, anticipating the words that would reshape this family's future. This court finds that primary custody of Emma shall be awarded to her mother, with the child's primary residence in her mother's home. Visitation rights for the father are hereby restricted to supervised visitation only, pending completion of specific court-ordered interventions and psychological treatment. Emma's father's face went white, then rapidly flushed crimson. His attorney leaned over, speaking urgently, but the judge continued, his voice overriding any objection. Furthermore, this court orders that the father complete the following before any modification to this arrangement can be considered. First, a complete psychological evaluation and treatment program with a therapist specializing in family dynamics and parental manipulation patterns. Second, a minimum of 6 months of parenting counseling focused on healthy parent-child relationships and appropriate boundaries. Third, a comprehensive evaluation of the father's understanding of the harm caused by his actions and his commitment to changing his behavior. Emma's mother reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, tears beginning to flow down her face, tears of relief, of vindication, of the burden of worry beginning to lift. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. What came next was entirely unexpected, something that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including Emma's mother's legal team. However, the judge continued, his tone shifting subtly, this court recognizes that this case involves a family in crisis, and that both parents likely made decisions from places of fear, anger, and pain related to the dissolution of their marriage. While the mother's behavior has been appropriate and protective, and the father's behavior has been manipulative and harmful, this court does not believe that permanent alienation of the father from his daughter serves the child's long term. He paused, letting his words sink in. Therefore, this court is offering the father an opportunity for redemption. If, over the course of the next 2 years, he completes all court-ordered psychological treatment and parenting education, demonstrates genuine insight into the harm he has caused, participates consistently in supervised visitation, and shows evidence of psychological change and growth, this custody arrangement may be revisited. The father will have the opportunity to work toward unsupervised visitation and eventually shared custody, contingent upon demonstrated change and the ongoing assessment of the child's. The judge's expression became intensely focused on Emma's father. I want to be absolutely clear. This is not a guarantee. This is an opportunity. Whether you take it or not, whether you genuinely commit to changing or whether you simply go through the motions, will determine the trajectory of your relationship with your daughter. Your child has demonstrated the courage to tell the truth in the face of enormous pressure. I am asking you to demonstrate the courage to confront your own behavior, to genuinely change, and to become the father your daughter deserves. Emma's father sat completely still, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear, but he didn't respond. The color in his face had drained away, leaving him looking ashen and defeated. Judge Harrison turned his attention to Emma's mother. The mother is awarded primary custody with full decision-making authority regarding the child's education, medical care, and general welfare. The mother will continue to be responsible for maintaining a safe, stable, and nurturing environment for this child. This court commends the mother for her dedication to her daughters throughout this difficult process. Then Judge Harrison did something highly unusual. He addressed Emma directly, speaking to her as if she were an adult, respecting her as a person rather than simply a minor subject to custody determinations. Emma, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary bravery you displayed in this courtroom. You were placed in an impossible situation by adults. You were pressured to lie, threatened with the loss of your father's love if you didn't comply, and subjected to psychological manipulation. Despite all of that, you found the courage to tell the truth. That courage, that integrity, that willingness to do what was right even when it was difficult, those are qualities that will serve you well throughout your life. This court recognizes that you have been the real adult in this proceeding, the one thinking clearly about what is right and what is wrong. I want you to know that your truth matters. Your voice matters. And your matters more than any custody arrangement, more than any victory, more than anything else in this courtroom. The judge's eyes were glistening slightly as he spoke, and there was an unusual depth of emotion in his formal judicial voice. Furthermore, this court is ordering that Emma continue therapeutic counseling with her current therapist, including continued sessions with the therapeutic dog, Max, who has proven to be an invaluable source of emotional support and healing. The court will cover the costs of these therapeutic services. Judge Harrison looked toward the back of the courtroom, where Max was now sitting more openly, having garnered special recognition from the court. The dog's ears perked forward as if he understood that he was being acknowledged for his extraordinary intervention. This case has taught me, and I hope it will teach this community, something important about custody disputes and family law. We cannot simply apply legal precedents and rules without considering the psychological reality of the people involved, particularly children. Children are not property to be awarded to the winner of a legal battle. They are human beings whose emotional, psychological, and spiritual must be the primary consideration in all decisions affecting their lives. The judge took a breath, and his expression became more severe as he addressed the courtroom at large. I'm also referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential perjury and child abuse charges related to the testimony coaching. While this court has made custody decisions prioritizing the child's and offering the father an opportunity for redemption, the criminal justice system may determine that additional accountability is appropriate. Emma's father's attorney immediately began gathering papers, whispering urgently with his client. But Judge Harrison raised his gavel, commanding attention one final time. This court is adjourned. The parties will receive written documentation of this judgment within 2 business days. The first supervised visitation will be scheduled for 1 week from today, pending the father's agreement to comply with all court-ordered interventions. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through the courtroom, marking not just the end of this particular hearing, but a fundamental shift in how this family would move forward. Emma looked up at her mother, who was openly crying now, her lawyer putting a reassuring arm around her shoulders. Emma felt something profound release within her, the burden of impossible choices, the weight of lies, the anxiety of divided loyalties beginning to transform into something else: hope. Beside her, Max remained steadfast, his presence a constant reminder that authentic compassion and unconditional support had made this moment possible. And as Emma watched her father gather his things and leave the courtroom with his attorney, she understood that what Judge Harrison had offered him, the opportunity for redemption, was perhaps the most merciful outcome possible. Whether he would take it remained to be seen. But at least the path forward was clear, and Emma was finally, truly safe. 6 months had passed since the day Emma gave the secret signal to Max in the courtroom. The golden retriever lay beside her in the park, his head resting on her lap while she absently stroked his silky ears. The autumn sun painted the sky in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the grass where they sat on a weathered wooden bench. Emma was no longer the anxious, fragmented child who had walked into that courthouse. She was still only 8 years old, but something fundamental had shifted within her, a sense of groundedness, of wholeness, of a self that had been fractured and was now, slowly and steadily, being restored. The past 6 months had been a journey of healing in ways Emma was still learning to understand. Her therapy sessions with her actual therapist, Doctor, had become a safe space where she could process everything that had happened. She had learned that what her father did was not her fault, that she was not responsible for his feelings or his choices, that telling the truth had been the right thing to do even when it was incredibly difficult. Doctor had helped her understand that children sometimes get placed in positions where they're forced to make impossible choices, and that recognizing the impossibility of those choices was the first step toward healing from them. The sessions with Max had become her favorite part of the week. The dog didn't judge her for the lies she'd told, didn't punish her for having been manipulated, didn't make her feel guilty for the complicated feelings she still had about her father. Max simply existed in his authenticity, his warm presence a constant reminder that unconditional support and acceptance were possible. In the park now, as she scratched behind his ears, Emma could feel the weight of anxiety that used to accompany her everywhere beginning to lift. She still had moments of worry, still sometimes experienced the old panic that would rise in her chest unexpectedly, but these moments were becoming fewer and further between. Her mother had transformed as well. The woman who had walked into that courthouse exhausted and frightened had gradually reclaimed her life and her confidence. Without the constant stress of the custody battle, without the need to prove her worth to a judge, Emma's mother had begun to heal from the emotional devastation of the divorce. She'd even started dating again, carefully and thoughtfully, making sure that any new relationship would be healthy for both herself and Emma. She had also become an advocate for other families in similar situations, volunteering with an organization that helped parents navigate custody disputes in ways that prioritized children's psychological. "I'm proud of you," Emma's mother had whispered to her one night, tucking her into bed. "I'm proud of the brave, honest person you are. I'm proud that you trusted yourself to tell the truth even when it was scary." Emma had cried that night, not from anxiety or fear, but from a profound sense of being seen and validated by the person she loved most in the world. The validation that she desperately needed had finally arrived, and it was coming from the source that mattered most. Her father's journey had taken a different path, one that was still unfolding. After the court hearing, he had initially been angry and defensive. He'd ranted to his girlfriend about the judge's unfair decision, about how he was being punished for simply trying to protect his daughter. But something had begun to shift within him during those first weeks after the verdict. Perhaps it was the shock of losing, or perhaps it was something deeper, a moment of genuine self-reflection that had cracked through his defensive armor. He had started attending the mandatory therapy sessions, initially with resistance and skepticism. But his therapist, a firm but compassionate woman named Dr. Lisa, had managed to do something that nobody else had been able to do. She had helped him see the situation from Emma's perspective. She had asked him to imagine what it would have been like to be 8 years old, pressured by a parent he loved to lie in front of a judge, threatened with abandonment if he didn't comply. She had helped him understand that his behavior, regardless of his intentions, had constituted abuse. The breakthrough had come about 3 months into his therapy when he'd had to write a letter to Emma apologizing for what he'd done. He'd written it, rewritten it dozens of times, tears streaming down his face as he tried to articulate the realization of how deeply he'd hurt his daughter. When he'd finally shared the letter with Doctor, she'd recognized genuine remorse, genuine understanding of the damage he'd caused. The first supervised visitation after the hearing had been awkward and painful. Emma had been nervous, worried that her father might be angry with her, might punish her for telling the truth in court. But when he had arrived for the supervised visit, he had done something unexpected. He had asked her to sit down and listen to something he needed to say. "Emma, I need to tell you that I'm sorry," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for telling you to lie. I'm sorry for making you feel like you had to choose between me and your mom. I'm sorry for telling you that I wouldn't love you if you didn't do what I said. None of that was okay, and it wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. I did something wrong, and I'm working really hard to become a better person and a better father." Emma had cried, and her father had held her, and for the first time since the divorce had begun, Emma had felt the possibility of genuine healing in their relationship, not the restoration of what had been, but the creation of something new, something healthier, something based on honesty rather than manipulation. 6 months had now passed, and Emma's father was continuing his therapeutic work. The supervised visitations had been gradually increasing in frequency. Judge Harrison, monitoring the case carefully, had authorized the removal of the supervision requirement for 1 visitation per month, pending continued progress. Emma's father was taking parenting classes, was working with his therapist on his patterns of control and manipulation, and was slowly beginning to understand the impact of his behavior on his daughter. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Emma still struggled with some anxiety when she was preparing for visits with her father. She still sometimes questioned her own perceptions and memories, a residual effect of having been systematically coached to doubt what she knew to be true. But she was healing, and her father appeared to be genuinely working toward change. Judge Harrison had been impacted profoundly by this case as well. He had published an article in a legal journal about custody disputes and the importance of recognizing child manipulation and coercion. He had begun training other judges on warning signs of parental coaching and the psychological impact of forcing children to lie in court. He had become an advocate within the judicial system for reform, arguing that custody determination should prioritize children's psychological above all other considerations. The case had also brought attention to Max and the therapeutic value of dogs in legal proceedings. Several other courts had begun exploring the possibility of allowing certified therapy animals in courtrooms during testimony from vulnerable witnesses, particularly children. Max had become something of a celebrity in legal circles, featured in articles and presentations about animal-assisted therapy. But for Emma, sitting in the park on this beautiful autumn afternoon, Max's head on her lap, the larger significance of what had happened was less important than the simple, profound fact that she was healing. She was becoming a person who knew that truth mattered, that her voice had power, that honesty, however difficult, was always the right path forward. "Thank you for being brave with me," Emma whispered to Max, the same words she'd spoken on the day of the courtroom intervention, but now they carried different weight. They were no longer the words of a desperate child in crisis, but the words of a survivor expressing gratitude for support that had transformed her life. Max wagged his tail, his tongue lolling out in a gentle dog smile, and in that moment, as the sun painted the park in golden light, Emma understood something profound. She had survived something that could have broken her. She had found her voice when she was silenced. She had chosen truth over the pressure to lie. She had allowed herself to be helped by someone, something, that loved her unconditionally. As they sat together in the peaceful park, with the autumn breeze rustling the leaves around them, Emma felt a deep sense of wholeness returning. The fractured pieces of her soul were finding their way back together, not exactly as they had been before, but stronger now, tempered by the trials she had endured, and held together by the love and support of those around her. The courtroom had been a place of trauma and impossible choices, but what had emerged from that trauma was not destruction, it was transformation. Emma had transformed from a victim into a survivor. Her mother had transformed from a frightened woman into a confident advocate. Her father was transforming, slowly and painfully, from a manipulative parent into someone capable of genuine remorse and change. And Judge Harrison had transformed from a judge, simply applying the law into a voice for systemic change within the legal system itself. All of it had begun with a small girl giving a secret signal to a dog. All of it had begun with one moment of authentic human connection in the midst of institutional coldness and legal formality. And as Emma sat in the park, safe and loved and whole, she knew that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she had already proven something essential about herself. She had the courage to choose truth, and that courage would sustain her through whatever came next.